of the things that I've been talking about a lot in the media over the last several months, especially during the winter when we were at our height in January and February, all the school stuff and politics, the stuff that's going on in Colorado and of course New York State. One of the things I talk a lot about is our rights and responsibilities. And the rights are self-evident. I'm a lot more worried in our community about talking about the responsibilities that come along with those rights. The responsibility that we have for defense of ourselves, our family, our home, and in the worst case, extreme scenario, our country. And those are what firearms ownership is all about. That's the baseline. The baseline that we're working on is the responsibility to defend yourself. The firearm is part of meeting that responsibility to defend yourself. So by coming to the NRA meeting, you certainly do your part to help us ensure and defend our rights. But you're also meeting your responsibility by coming to these seminars to be prepared as a legal firearms owner to defend yourself, your family, your home, and the worst case scenario, our country. So I appreciate that very much. The session this morning, defensive shooting skill development. Defensive shooting skill development is something that would have been very different 20 years ago, and or wouldn't even have been a separate and distinct topic. If you go back and look at any area of science or research, any body of knowledge, if you go back far enough, you'll find a time and a place where one person could be the expert and kind of know everything there was to know about all aspects of that body of knowledge. And if we look at like the medical field, you go back far enough, there was one person in the village, one person in the tribe, one person in the settlement that was the doctor. And they handled everything from dentistry to psychology to stomach ailments to bones and everything else. But today, you practically need a different specialist for a left elbow and a right elbow. One guy does ears, the other guy does eyes, the other guy does knees. Because there's so much knowledge that we have about the human body, so much knowledge that we have about the medical profession, so much knowledge that we have about healthcare and medicine, nutrition, fitness. You know, all of these things were in one guy's head if we go back far enough in history. But as the science and the art and the research and the philosophy and our knowledge and our empirical evidence and our experience in that area of knowledge expanded, we ended up with very specialized areas of medicine. Because there isn't one person that can hold all that stuff in their head, from neurosurgery to stomach ailments to childbirth. Well, shooting is a very, very known subject in the span of human existence. And the study of defensive shooting and the teaching of defensive shooting, especially in the private sector, is incredibly young. That industry has not been in existence beyond the span of the lifetime of most of the people in this room. Even in a military sense, or in a hunting sense, or a target shooting sense, what we're talking about is the differences between shooting and defensive shooting. We're talking about the difference between trap shooting and precision rifle. What the difference between competition shooting and using a shotgun for home defense. And there are some significant differences. And that's really what this seminar is about. What are we talking about when we say defensive shooting skill development, as opposed to just shooting, or just marksmanship, just target shooting, just competition shooting? And those things are fine. How many of you are firearms enthusiasts? How many of you primarily own guns for the defense of yourself, your family, your home, and worst case scenario, your country? Pretty much the same. And I think that's the case. Obviously, I sort of set the deck out in my favor by saying that any defensive shooting. But I think that's the truth about American gun ownership, is that primarily we are here in the interest of having the opportunity to defend ourselves if we need to.
Okay, what you just saw was part of the opening of my defensive firearm shooting fundamentals or skill development session at the 2013 NRA meetings. Now, I gave that 3 times, talked to probably somewhere between 1,200 and 1,500 people during those 3 sessions spread out over 3 days. A lot of attention's been given to the home defense seminar that I gave, but not as much to this one. Now, this seminar, one of the things you heard me talk about was this idea that we as American firearms owners generally have firearms for our personal home, family, or in the worst case scenario, national defense. And I really do think that's true. I think it's more and more true every day that many more of the new gun owners who are purchasing firearms are doing so without any hesitation, primarily for defensive purposes and not for sporting purposes, competition purposes, or hunting purchases, which may have been more true in the past. Knowing that that's true, we also see an increase in people going to get training, people going to get their concealed carry permits, people going to different training classes like the ones that I offer or many other people offer inside of the industry, and that is awesome. But what you didn't see in that particular video clip, and it was actually from another one of the seminars that we didn't record, was the follow-up to my two questions. The first question is, are you a firearms enthusiast? Are you a firearms collector? Of course, the majority of the people at the NRA convention raised their hand proudly, as do I. I am absolutely a firearms enthusiast and a firearms collector. The second question is, are you someone who primarily owns firearms for defensive purposes? And most of the people in that room continued to keep their hand up. Now what's interesting, and you probably saw it in that video, you can go back and look at it, there are a couple of people who didn't put their hands up to say they were firearms enthusiasts, but they did put their hands up to say that they own firearms for defensive purposes, and I think that's great, obviously. I think that's the primary reason that people should own firearms, is to defend themselves or others if they need to. Now, all that said, I have a problem with some of the people who have that gun collection but have never actually gone out and taken defensive firearms training. And this is where I pose the question to you. Are you a firearms enthusiast, or are you truly someone who, in action and in word, owns firearms primarily for defensive purposes? And a couple years ago I wrote an article where I put numbers to it, and I said this: if you have more than 5 firearms and you have not paid to take a professional defensive shooting course, then you probably should just put your hand up about the firearms collector and enthusiast and not say that you're someone who really does own guns primarily for defensive purposes if you go out and buy a 6th gun before you take a class. Now, obviously a lot of people get kind of pushed back by that. I don't want to insult anybody, I don't want to offend anybody, but I do want to kind of call some people out on the reality of having 20 guns in a safe and 0 formal training days on a range indicates that you lean towards the gun enthusiast or gun collector side. As you also heard me talk about in that opening piece, defensive shooting is something very different from sport shooting, it's something very different from marksmanship training. And no, I don't count getting your concealed carry permit and meeting the state minimum to get that piece of paper where there is such a thing as serious defensive firearms training. When you go to that class, usually you're going to learn about the law, you're going to learn about your legal responsibilities, you might learn a little bit about firearms storage and care and maintenance. You might even get some shooting snuck in there, but it's probably going to be marksmanship-based shooting, target shooting, and I've never seen any of those courses that are mandated by the state that require any significant degree of firearms training, actually out on the range, development of skill, and any hope of developing competency in the context of the concealed carry course. So, of course, we have an introduction to concealed carry course also at i.c.e. training, and I wouldn't consider that enough to claim that you are truly a person who is primarily interested in the defensive ownership of firearms if you had 30 guns in your safe, but you only had that one 8-hour, 6-hour class under your belt. So obviously I run a training company. I think training is important. Make sure that we understand the relationship between those two things. I run a training company because I think training is important. This is what I've dedicated my life to doing, putting out information, books, DVDs, articles, blogs, videos like this one, as well as running classes and running instructor development to help other people run classes. But whether you train with me or you train with anyone else in the industry, I don't think there's anybody out there who truly doesn't have your best interest at heart. I may disagree with the techniques that they're running, I may disagree with some people's marketing, none of that really matters at the end of the day. They're teaching you what they think you need to know to defend yourself or others in a worst case scenario. The same thing I do, the same thing all the combat focused shooting instructors do, the same thing that all the personal defense network contributors do. And I encourage you to maybe go count the guns. You know, the ones in the safe, the ones in the closet, the ones in the attic. How many guns do you have? How many do you really need in that worst case scenario? And should you be out there taking some training? There's a big difference between someone who just collects guns and grew up shooting, or maybe even was in the military or even in law enforcement. The skills of defensive shooting are very different than the skills you pick up as a shooter, as a hunter, as a sportsman, as a competitor, and even serving in the military in a much more proactive arms use environment. So I encourage you to go out and really meet your obligation as someone who says they own firearms for defensive purposes to train. If you can't afford it, I get it. But if you have 20 guns in the safe, I think you can afford it. So the first gun, the second gun, third gun, fourth gun, fifth gun, before you get that sixth one, go out and take a class. And obviously, for those of you who already have more than 5 guns, well, this is your opportunity now to dedicate some time this spring, this summer, at some point in the next year. Again, I'm not a big fan of selling firearms, and I get it. But if you're telling your family, and if you're telling yourself, if you're telling your neighbors, if you're telling everybody on the interwebs that you primarily own guns for personal defense, but you've never taken a class, I think you should. Get out there and train. Meet your responsibility, not just your right to own defensive firearms. Because part of that responsibility is actually being capable of using them in that worst case dynamic scenario to protect yourself or others when you need to.